Hello and welcome to More Than a Game. I'm Patrick Ridge. I'm joined today by John Blaine and Sam Cuthbert, who has joined us several times on the channel already to discuss PSR. Sam is a sports barrister now with 4 new square chambers, and we thought we'd catch up to do a bit of an end of season PSR summary review, get Sam's expertise, and also throw it forward to next season as well. So we'll dive straight in, Sam. The last relevant case ended up being Nottingham Forest's appeal. We'll touch on Everton shortly, but Nottingham Forest appealed against their 4 point deduction. They weren't successful. They didn't receive any points back, and their appeals board were at times quite damning of their appeal. The appeal focused on 2 grounds mainly that I just want to start getting your views on. Forest re-argued the case about Brennan Johnson, which we discussed in our last show, and they also argued the wording in some of the original independent commission's decisions. So first and foremost, before I throw it on to John to look at kind of the decision as a whole and any surprise that you had by that, can you just overview what Forest's grounds were and what you thought of those arguments?
Sure. So you rightly pointed out that they had 2 grounds, the first of which is related to what they referred to as player A. This is the mitigation argument that you'll have heard an awful lot about, i.e., when he was being sold outside of the PSR deadline, and Forest effectively waiting until they had an offer that they thought met the correct valuation for him. And the second ground was about whether or not to suspend the sentence against them. As far as the first ground goes, I think some people have said that it was sort of curious that they have tried to effectively retread this argument. I think ultimately they really had to do that because it was such a crucial point. It was such a significant amount of money. The club were effectively saying that their reasons for selling Brennan Johnson 2 months after the PSR deadline should be treated as mitigation, and that the points deduction should be suspended. But the difficulty that they faced was that the commission had already noted that the club had rejected offers in July 23. And if they had been accepted, they'd have gone an awfully long way to clearing the PSR breach, or sort of filling a big hole in the club's balance sheets. But those offers were obviously rejected because they were below what the club saw as the correct valuation for Johnson. And you can see from that the club was effectively holding out for a higher fee later in the window. And so some might say it was fair for the commission to say effectively that making the sale a near miss was a less important factor as against what may be deemed to be the correct motivation, which was maximizing value and profit. So that was the reason that they didn't win on that ground. The second ground, looking to suspend the sentence, and this is obviously parasitic on the first. So, in the event that there is a deduction to be made, we want to appeal whether or not it should be suspended. And what principally the appeal board said there was, yes, we have the power to do that. That much is not in dispute or controversial, but in the circumstances, we have to consider effectively the fairness to the other clubs. And if we do suspend the sentence, that will have a knock-on impact. So that I think those are the two grounds, and yeah, those are my thoughts on them.
That's very interesting then. So as well, and I know John wants to pick up on this point with how it relates to then Everton's non-appeal in the end in their second case. So did you have any surprise that Forest didn't get anything back? Because I know when we spoke originally, you did think they might have a good case to at least maybe get something back, as Everton did originally on the appeal.
Possibly. I mean, you're never going to be surprised if an appeal fails because ultimately this came through. There is, whether it's a sports arbitral tribunal, whether it's standard court proceedings, there is often a deference to the tribunal that first hears a matter because they are deemed to be closer to the evidence and have had an ability to analyze the evidence in a way that sometimes the appellate tribunals don't necessarily get the chance to do. But what we get in the Forest appeal is a kind of helpful summary of the standard that an appealing party needs to reach in order to succeed in its appeal. So you'll have read in the decision about appropriate respect being said to be given to the Commission's judgment, not least on the extent to which mitigation was afforded by the sale of Brennan Johnson. So that's obviously Forest's big argument. And the key point was that the appeal board found on this that there was that was a matter of judgment. That was a matter on which opinions might reasonably be said to differ. And without an error of law, then the appeal board effectively are going to be slow to intervene in the Commission's finding. They're going to give the Commission's finding that appropriate respect. Now, maybe a good example of where the appeal board has identified a Commission erring in law is the 2020 Sheffield Wednesday appeal, where the Commission was found in that case to have failed to take into account a relevant factor for assessing sanction. We obviously didn't have that in the Forest appeal. The point is that it's very difficult really to appeal judgments on the facts for which there may be a range of reasonable positions, and it's much easier to appeal legal failings, i.e. failures to take into account proper or reasonable issues. So I think there's also another point. It's interesting that we have this kind of clear articulation now of the notion that the Commission was effectively entitled to look at Forest selling Johnson 2 months post the PSR deadline as more severe than Sheffield Wednesday selling their stadium 2 weeks after the PSR deadline. And I think what we can do is we can deduce from that that there's no bright line now really for quantifying the severity of breach, but the further that your mitigation is from the PSR deadline, the less likely you are to succeed in arguing that that mitigation should have the intended consequences.
Yeah, I do think that follows some logic, doesn't it, John? I know you're gonna pick up now, but being 2 months late rather than 1 or 2 weeks late is a big difference.
Well, it is, and I have to say, Patrick, and obviously Sam, you're the expert in the room, but when I read the judgment, the first thing that struck me was, is that it? Is that the appeal for the ground for appeal? I mean, that's just not going to fly, right? Because we have this in the sporting context with VAR, where we have a referee sitting in a porter cabin somewhere, and we have a referee on a football pitch, and yet we have the inverse of what you're rightly saying, in the sense that because he has the camera angles and all those sorts of things, the man in the porter cabin does have a clearer view of incidents than the guy who's 10 meters away, you know? But in this case, and in all cases, I assume, if it's just a matter of opinion, then you have to go with what the original judge said, surely, which was my layperson's view. And I think it says that in the judgment that the appeal board said it was within the bounds of a reasonable outcome. Therefore, ultimately, to use the VAR example, it's not a clear and obvious error, and therefore we're not going to turn it over. Is that, a fair assumption, or a fair opinion from me?
Yeah, well, look, I think the VAR comparison might be doing a bit of heavy lifting there. I think you need to look at the way that the appeal board deals with the Commission's decisions through the lens of litigation, through the lens of appellate tribunals looking at the original decision as made, and acknowledging that the original decision maker is going to be closer to the evidence and closer to the facts. And so when it comes to making those slightly more difficult, more granular decisions as to kind of judgment calls, those judgment calls should not be interrupted or intervened with unless there is some matter of law which kind of permeates through them and infects them such that they are logical or can't be said to sort of to sustain whatever sanction that flows from them. So I think we're probably on the same page there, John, albeit I wouldn't necessarily draw a parallel between the VAR situation as currently we have it in the Premier League and the appeal board and how they deal with commission's decisions.
Maybe that's because you're a barrister and I'm not. Yeah. you you don't want this thrown at you at court one day, do you? But in all seriousness, I think we are quite close, and maybe the analogy isn't great, but maybe for our audience it's a bit better for them than it is for you per se, right? But what then struck me was that for a business, i.e. Nottingham Forest, which had got points given back to them after an entry point which ended up at 6 points, and they got a couple back. And one of the reasons they got those points back included, not wasting the court's time and saving time and money by early pleas of guilt and so on. But this seems to be the exact opposite. I mean, to me, this seems to have been a trivial appeal. So that's a layperson's view. So as a barrister or legal eagle for us, what justifies the time and effort that went into that appeal from the court side, if you will, when it seems to me what every rank and file football fan who knows nothing about law thought was going to happen happened?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think probably if you're Nottingham Forest and you're looking at something like the Sheffield Wednesday appeal, the golden point of mitigation, and you've seen that, and you think that there's a chance that you might be able to push the bounds of the jurisprudence that sets out, that at that stage it's probably worth trying and seeing if the appeal board are with you on that. I would imagine that Notts Forest and their legal team would have been aware of some of the potential issues in their case. Not least that they only really had the first ground, and if they lost on the first ground, then the second ground came into play. So I would think Nottingham Forest went into this kind of eyes wide open. But that's not to say that it's not worth trying a point, just because you end up losing on appeal.
Okay, I mean, I think that's fair. One thing that, of course, for me anyway, when I read the judgment that came out of this appeal, was a restating of some of the things that happened subsequently in Everton too, I guess, and the like, because Everton tried to appeal as well, didn't they, in and around some of these things, which was that the points deduction should be immediate. It seems to me that that's been further force has been added to that. So if we do start talking about who's going to suffer punishments in the next round of this thing, which I guess starts next January time, if notwithstanding there's some clubs, and I think Pat's going to bring in Leicester, for example, that whatever points deductions are levied against clubs almost certainly are going to be immediately applied.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in circumstances where the first issue that the appeal board deal with on this point is, well, after they've established that they've got the power to do it, so they have the jurisdiction to suspend if they want to. After they've established that, they go on and say, but we have to consider whether it would be fair to the clubs who haven't been found in breach. And I don't think you necessarily need to be a lawyer to see the sense in that. If you're effectively saying, yes, we are due a points deduction, but please hold off imposing the sanction for now, that puts you on the same footing for now as somebody that hasn't had the same level of breach. And there is an implicit unfairness in that. So without good reason to suspend, and there wasn't a good reason in this case, and similarly, if there isn't a good reason in ensuing cases, I would think you're probably right, John, that the sanctions will be imposed immediately.
Good one, thanks, Sam.
I'm just touching on that as well, Sam. Before we do move on, as John mentioned, there to some future cases. Do you think Everton's lawyers looked at the situation with the Forest appeal, and obviously it coincided, it came out just as Everton were getting themselves safe anyway. I can't remember off the top of my head if Everton maybe even were safe by that point or all but guaranteed safety. And they just were, yeah, and they went, we'll probably drop this, whereas it comes back to, like you said, with Forest, there was points on the line. Forest needed to stay up. Like every point could be valuable at that point, and you think Everton looked at the decision and just thought, well, we're probably not going to have as much luck as we did maybe in the first appeal here.
Well, look, we're speculating at this point because the statement that we got from the club was pretty opaque, wasn't it? They said,
Yes.
Something along the lines of the hearing, which is due to take place later on this month, is now no longer going to happen. I would think, looking at this as a football fan more than anything, I would think that they, having secured their position in the league, probably would have thought, well, let's let sleeping dogs lie. Obviously, GCs and clubs and legal teams are going to be reading these decisions and considering how they impact the way that a given club goes on to present its PSR, etc., going forwards. But I would be surprised if it was the outcome of the Notts Forest appeal which put them off the further appeal, not least because the facts are quite different. And also you're very likely to be in front of a different panel. There might be some members of the panel who overlap, but the chances of having the same panel are very slim. So yeah, I think whilst clubs are going to have one eye on what other clubs are doing and the various decisions which are coming out, I think I'd be surprised if that was the principal decision behind Everton deciding to withdraw the part of the appeal which was bumped off until the summer. I think that's probably more likely to do with the fact that they're secure now in their position, and the fans, I imagine, probably don't want this hanging over their heads. The club doesn't necessarily want to hang over its head. As I said before, let sleeping dogs lie.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sam, and I think the principal reasons were twofold, because they do look at other clubs. And I think they looked at Crystal Palace beating Manchester United, right, and concluded that if we did appeal, we may get 1 point back and it will not make any difference whatsoever to how far up the league we would go. That and the huge cost of people like you, I think, because saving money in our predicaments, this becomes circular, doesn't it? You spend money defending yourself from spending too much money. So I think that was a serious point, that saving the cost and, of course, the court's time. And, of course, we do anticipate that at some time in the future, we've got to do part 2 of Everton 2 yet. So maybe they just wanted to get some, give the teacher an apple or something, just to see if that helps down the track. But you alluded, Pat, to, and Everton are one, but there could be multiple clubs who face these commissions, perhaps before the season even starts.
Yes, we've obviously got Leicester, who a team close to Sam's heart, I believe, but they were charged.
No comment there, look.
Yeah, a few months ago now, weren't they, with a breach of PSR. They did come up, and we now are in the ridiculous situation where a club has been promoted as champions of one league, and now comes into a new one and faces the potential prospect of either starting the season with a points deduction or pretty much knowing at some stage they will get a points deduction. And then we've also got plenty of other clubs, Everton included, Nottingham Forest potentially included. There's been a report today that Nottingham Forest know they're going to have to sell a big player, bring in big profit before the end of June, or at least within the leeway period. And, the likes of Aston Villa, Newcastle, Chelsea, we still don't know what's happening with them, all potentially in the dock, so to speak, next season, Sam. Just from also a legal perspective, and then your own point as a football fan as well. How are the Premier League going to go about handling this? Like we've seen at times the bandwidth of the Premier League's legal team and the Premier League's team themselves has been stretched thin this season. Do you think they're going to have to almost make allowances because there could be so many teams that are potentially in breach? Do you think it's going to have to be a bit of compromise on both sides?
Yeah, look, I don't envy the Premier League's position. They have an important role in ensuring and guaranteeing financial propriety in the way that football clubs are run, and they've put rules in place that need to be enforced, and litigation is seemingly the best and probably the only way of properly enforcing them. I think what this really gets at is an issue that we've discussed on the podcast before, which is the way in which the legal process rubs up against the football process. And that's something that we've seen writ large this year, and it's played out time and again. I think ultimately there has to be a pragmatic approach taken. If you maybe to use a better analogy, if you were, for instance, looking at whether to prosecute a criminal case, you would be trying to establish, what the interest to the public was in prosecuting, and that's a level of pragmatism that may need to be kind of imputed into any decision as to whether or not clubs are charged going forwards, particularly in circumstances where the PSR rules are due to change, and we've got this, this anchoring system coming in. So I think there will have to be a level of pragmatism. There will have to be at some point a decision made where you have to draw a line under it, so as to avoid a situation like we've got now, where Man City have won 4 titles on the bounce, but everyone's looking at it thinking, is that silverware going to be taken away? Is there any certainty in winning the Premier League anymore? Is the spectacle itself diluted by the fact that ultimately there are asterisks left at the end of the season? I think all of those things feed in to a conclusion that there has to be a practical, pragmatic approach taken to decisions as to whether or not to charge clubs going forwards.
Yeah, I have a thought about this, Pat, if it's okay.
Yeah.
I think they're very wise words and very carefully chosen, I think, because the Premier League have got themselves into a bit of a spot here, because we do have potential multiple ICs to take place, maybe subsequent appeals, and all the uncertainty that would bring to the league table with multiple asterisks everywhere. And of course, the Premier League shareholders, notwithstanding they change in June, but when 3 leave and 3 join, have sort of already voted for a change of regime because they've been unhappy with the way this one has been executed. It strikes me that a good answer might be, having put the frighteners on existing Premier League clubs by what happened to Nottingham Forest and Everton, when the financials are all done and dusted, i.e. the financial years have finished, not necessarily that they've been reported upon, it might be wise, I think, for the Premier League to basically have a ceasefire for 12 months and say, right, okay, we know you guys are all sort of compliant up to the end of season 24. Season 24-25, which is 2 transfer windows, will be dealt with under the new rules. Therefore, we'll just leave whatever's in process. We'll just leave those. I can't imagine, I'm an Everton fan, right? And if Leicester City were told, you've got some good fortune here, we're not going to pursue you for what happened before, because we're just not going to, because the rules are changing and so on. I think they were lucky, but I wouldn't personally be too uptight about it, because I think they're going to struggle anyway. I think the integrity of the league, though, if Leicester are to struggle anyway, and then they get stiffed with a -6 point deduction, we could find ourselves in a farcical situation where very early in the season, a court has already decided who the relegated team might be, or had a significant impact upon it. So I don't know what the Premier League's wherewithal and capability is to think about suspension of these types of rules, or a ceasefire, or whatever we choose to call it. But certainly the shareholders themselves can clearly force, the executive in the guise of Richard Masters to do whatever they want. So I think June's Premier League shareholders meeting might be quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I think there's something in that. I think it's probably worth adding to that just a quick explainer that so the Premier League is a private company limited by shares, and
right.
The shareholders that are the 20 members, the 20 member clubs at any given time, plus the FA, which is a kind of special share.
Yeah, golden share or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what that means is that it can be difficult to make decisions. So imposing things like a ceasefire or imposing things like a sanctions tariff might be difficult in the way that they have been in the past with the sanctions tariff. That said, the Premier League has now voted for the new spending rules from the 2025-26 season, albeit Man United, Man City, Aston Villa voted against, and I think Chelsea, I think, abstained. So it is possible to make those sorts of decisions, and if there's an appetite for it, then there's a mechanism to ensure that those decisions can be put in place. You know, the overhaul to the PSR regime is a substantial change. And so, you know, it's not beyond the wit of man. It's not beyond the wit of the Premier League shareholders to make a change like that if there is an appetite for it.
And finally, Sam, then from a legal standpoint on that, if clubs are brought, if let's say the Premier League don't do this, they do still try these clubs next season. If it's 4 or 5, however many it is. Do you think the argument that clubs may have, or at least their legal teams will have, is, you know, the punishment has got to be, everything's got to be taken into account that these rules are also changing as well, and moving forward, this wouldn't happen to these clubs. So is it fair that it happens now? Like, I'm obviously coming from a complete simple perspective there. So what would be the legal argument in that side? Is the one to make really if future rules are changing?
Well, I think it's difficult to change the rules and you know, draw a line under historic breaches without there being some allegation of unfairness. Implicitly, that, you know, people are going to be getting away with breaches that haven't necessarily been tried. But the point really is whether or not the pragmatic element kind of outweighs that, whether or not the need for certainty in the league, whether or not the need to know where you stand as a club at the end of a season outweighs the potential unfairness that may come with drawing a line under historic breaches. I think from the Premier League's perspective, the two things that it needs to take forwards into the next season are probably consistency and expediency, which are, I think, probably the two things which have most frustrated and probably not surprised some of the lawyers over the course of this season. So it may be the fact that the new anchoring provisions start to guarantee that consistency. So just for a short explainer on that, that effectively works by clubs only being able to spend a maximum of 75 to 80% of, in its purest form, it means that kind of all clubs are able to spend a maximum of the multiple of what the bottom club earns in TV revenue. I hope I've explained that, you know, shortly as well as I possibly can. And within that, it hopefully will be the case that consistency in terms of sanction can be guaranteed. It'll be more obvious where there have been breaches. It should be a quicker process as well, and to that extent, sort of sweep up any issue that remains ongoing at the end of sweeping up an issue that remains ongoing at the end of a season should be an easier prospect, because the need for elongated, drawn out litigation is reduced by the fact of this formula being a kind of neater way of guaranteeing PSR compliance.
I think consistency and speed would be something that everyone is after, isn't it, after this season, the Premier League included as well. I think just, the final thought from myself, and John, I don't know if you want to sum up as well, but it does just seem that has to be the key moving forward, doesn't it? That there is some level of fairness, but also, as you really rightly pointed out, Sam, I think the sporting integrity and where that line is and how they can make it fair, but you don't get and I do think we can look back at it now and probably everybody involved is maybe secretly glad that Everton and Forest were safe by the final day. like, you know, the Premier League can probably be, and I'm not saying that those clubs didn't do wrong and didn't deserve punishment, but if you'd had a situation where two clubs were relegated, or one of those two clubs were relegated because they didn't get a point back on appeal, or they were deducted points, and that just opens up a whole new can of worms moving forward. And maybe it can be almost a clean break now, and they can say, right, yeah, these clubs need to be punished, but we've got to prioritise the sporting integrity. Like I think could, you know, out of season deductions that are immediate, but they get, you know, sort these cases out in the summer when there's no football on, when it is just done and everyone at least knows, okay, you start the season on -3 points, you start the season on -6, whatever it is. It's not ideal, but if they're going to go down that road, that would seem the fairest to me. John, do you want to have a final point before we finish? Or sorry, Sam to pick up on that?
Well, let's. Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I think where we agree is that none of us, and you know, I'd be surprised if you'd be able to find anyone, want the league to be determined. Ultimately, you watch football for football and not for the kind of machinations going on in the background. And so hopefully with the new PSR, we can guarantee that kind of consistency and expediency that we've been talking about. And hopefully that means that the results are played out on the pitch rather than in front of a judge.
I think they're great final words, so I'm going to hold my powder for another podcast with you, Pat. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant place to end it on. Thank you very much, Sam. So that's been our PSR recap summary episode. Sam, I'm sure we'll be back on again in a few months. We'll have said all this, and then, you know, the Premier League and the clubs will go and do their own thing anyway. But it's been intriguing getting all your thoughts this season. Thank you so much for your expertise as well. The videos have been fantastic, as I'm sure our audience will agree as well. And definitely informed me a lot more than I was what was it, October, November time before all this started happening. But yeah, it's been fantastic to get your insight. Thank you for watching, everybody, or listening. If you're listening to this on the podcast, on the audio streams, please check out the More Than Game YouTube channel and subscribe to that, as well as subscribing to More Than a Game on Substack as well, where on both platforms you can catch the previous two interviews we did with Sam, one in April and one in March, which are absolutely fantastic, diving into the cases as they were at that point in time as well. Thanks to Sam, thanks to John, and thanks for watching.